Packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer JJ Manella, and I'm back, and I'm here as always with Drew Conry Murray. We've had a few weeks of weirdness where Drew's been gone and then I was gone, and I'm just really wondering if you guys missed me last week when Drew recorded without me.
I'm sure they did. Absolutely.
Or if it was kind of a nice relief.
I had to do it all by myself.
Oh, anyway, maybe I don't want to know how you guys felt about that. But as a reminder, if you do have feedback for us, remember that you can hop over to packetpushers.net/FU for follow-up. And maybe even better, if you want to join us on the Packet Pushers community Slack, you can just go to packetpushers.net and then you'll look under community and there's instructions on joining Slack there. And there's different channels for different things. There is a Packet Protector podcast channel where we can chat about whatever you want to talk about. A couple of other quick notes. This is going to be a news-only session or episode for us. We have a lot to cover this week. We're coming back in. We've got some interesting things coming up for you in the next few weeks, though. But moving forward, we're going to be looking at a slight format change, which is to split the news off of the not news. So they'll come out at the same time, same day and everything. If you want to hear the news, you can do that. Or if you're kind of scrolling back through episodes and interested in other things and not the news, you can just listen to that piece only a little more easily. So we're going to talk about today's news, and then I'm hoping I can coax Drew into telling us about his trip. I was on an Alaskan cruise for a week, which was really cool, but Drew was in Africa, among other places, and I am really uber interested in hearing more about that. So at the end of it, I'm going to ask, and you guys can listen in on that. But first, let's check out this week's news.
Yeah, so we're going to go through a lot of vulnerability news and a bunch of other things. We'll start with Progress Software. They make a popular file transfer application called MoveIt. They've announced critical vulnerabilities in the product that could lead to authentication bypass. Progress Software has released an updated version and recommends customers update right away. However, the company also announced that there's a third-party vulnerability in the application that requires separate mitigation. This includes blocking inbound RDP access to MoveIt and limiting outbound access from MoveIt to trusted endpoints.
This one's interesting to me. So the big MoveIt vulnerability started, was it early this year or last year?
Last year, they had some significant vulnerabilities, and companies like British Airways and others actually had data stolen through exploits of those vulnerabilities.
Yes. And then there was the CVE that's, I think from this year, that's 2024-5806. That vulnerability got elevated from a 7.4 score up to a 9.1 during this update. So the quote says something like, a newly identified vulnerability in a third-party component used in MoveIt transfer elevates the risk of the original issue mentioned if left unpatched. But then right after that, it says, while the patch distributed by Progress on June 11th successfully remediates the issue in the CVE, this newly disclosed third-party vulnerability introduces new risk. So honestly, I'm still confused as to whether the patch completely resolves this new issue, because it says it introduces new risk. So definitely maybe keep an eye on this. This is an update just from today, day recording on the 27th. So keep an eye on this if you're using this software still. Certainly stay up with patches.
Yeah, Ars Technica is reporting that there may be as many as 2,700 instances of the application installed globally. So it is out there. And even if you think you might not be using it, somebody else in the org might be. And just as a plug for this notion of Progress Software dealing with its own vulnerabilities, but also trying to cope with vulnerabilities in third-party components of its system, the last week's episode was on software bills of materials, or SBOMs. And this is one of the things an SBOM can help you with in looking at everything that's in a software package, including what came from the folks that sold you the software, plus whatever else, other libraries, components, and so on that they're using as part of that application that they may not have insight onto what's vulnerable in there. And an SBOM can help you out with that. So if you're interested, check out last week's episode.
Well, I was going to say Progress Company and MoveIt are very, I would say, commonly adopted pieces of software. Even if you haven't heard of it, probably at least one organization you're doing business with, a large organization, if not more, are using it. And every time I hear MoveIt, I just think about 2005, the Madagascar movie where you've got King Julian and they do the song like, I like to move it, move it. I like to move it, move it. I think now MoveIt, the software, came around before that, but it still makes me happy to sing it and dance it every time we talk about this.
That was also in my head, and I was just going to leave it there, but it's out now, so let's all enjoy it.
Drew, I'm going to get you out of your shell before this is over with.
Challenge accepted.
All right, let's talk about firewalls.
Let's talk about firewalls. The Cisco Firepower 2130 Threat Defense Firewall received the lowest ranking out of 8 products tested by an independent testing outfit called Cyber Ratings. SDX Central reported on the findings. Firewalls from Juniper, Checkpoint, Fortinet, Palo Alto, and others received high marks for effectiveness, but the Firepower 2130 got a caution rating. According to SDX Central, the Firepower received this low ranking because of how poorly it dealt with encrypted traffic, because it missed 100 evasion techniques, and because of low throughput.
This is interesting to me. So, Cyber Ratings is I think a C6 based not for profit organization. And now look, let's be real. Anytime you've got this type of, especially firewall testing, it's really easy for vendors to pick a testing outfit with an organization with a set of tests that is going to show their solution the best light, right? Like
Yes.
some products are going to be better at certain types of throughputs and inspections and speeds and feeds, and others at others. But this is kind of, in my mind, totally different. So having come from a long history of watching like NSS Labs and other ratings like this isn't, one vendor went out and found a very favorable type of test for their product. This is one product is scored very poorly. And they're specifically calling out, encryption, TLS inspection, and also missing the very basic evasion techniques that an attacker might use.
Mhm.
So to call out one as being this deficient, now I haven't read the full test report. I don't know if anybody else has yet. Not trying to, knock Cisco Firepower here, but I am really curious to see, some of the response in this, in the coming days and weeks, because that's significant. And it's even more significant when you start looking at, I think they did like a price per megabit or price per throughput analysis.
Yes.
Those kind of things are like typically a little bit silly, but the order of magnitude of what the Cisco was costing was like 10, 20, and 30 fold the rest of the solutions. So that's definitely not flattering either.
No, for sure. Yeah, I'm always a little bit skeptical of these kind of reports, particularly if I can't get access to it and sort of dig into the methodology. And this report is behind a paywall. It does cost thousands of dollars, so we haven't had a chance to read it ourselves to get a good look at the methodology. But I will say this is from a summary that we'll link to in the show notes from Cyber Ratings, talking about what they did in this test. It says, quote, "The products were subjected to thorough testing to determine how they handled TLS 1.2 and 1.3 cipher suites, how they defended against 1,509 exploits, where the protection could be bypassed by any of the 1,569 evasions, and if the devices would remain stable under adverse conditions. To provide a more realistic rating based on modern network traffic, both clear text and encrypted traffic were measured." So, I mean, it does seem like, based on that paragraph, a reasonable and decent test. But again, in any of these things, you need to take it with a grain of salt.
It will be interesting to see. And, again, mentioning NSS Labs, I remember their model, at least when I was kind of working with them, their model was they would test the product. I want to make sure I get this right, but I'm sure one of you guys listening will correct us if this is wrong.
Mhm.
They would test the product, but they were going to release the results, period.
Mhm.
Versus other models and other analyst programs where the vendor sponsors and pays for the testing and report, and then they pay for the access to the report and findings.
Right.
Vic, who was one of the founders of Cyber Ratings, also was a founder of NSS Labs back in the day, which was that model. And so I'm just not familiar with how Cyber Ratings does that, but that it's behind a paywall is interesting. So I would love to get our hands on that and be able to read it, or talk to somebody who's read it and understand a little bit more about how meaningful the tests were and what types of tests they were. Maybe next week we'll have an update for you.
Yeah, and I'll say I used to work for a publication called Network Computing, and way back in the day, Network Computing actually had testing labs, and they would bring products in and do some pretty robust testing. But again, there were issues like Company X came in and brought staff and helped the testing unit to set everything up and get it configured properly, and maybe configured it a little bit to do well in the testing environment, while maybe Company B didn't do that. So there's always wiggle room in terms of, the methodology, the lab environment, the environment it was set up in, the tools that are used, where vendors can sort of look at the output and say, well, we got this result because of XYZ, and maybe it wasn't completely fair. So
Yeah,
again, as we said, it's one data point, and you should take that into account.
it's like a sports car and a pickup truck, right?
Yeah, they're both cars.
If you have an F-150 or
Yes.
an F-250 and you can haul a ton of dirt around, and you're being rated on how much and how well you can travel with, a ton of dirt in the back of your vehicle or deal in inclement weather, that's going to be different than how a Ferrari or a
Right.
Porsche stands up, right? So
Exactly.
it just depends on how the tests are being done. So more on that, stay tuned.
Yeah. All right, we'll move on. Some more vulnerability news. Microsoft has announced a remote code execution vulnerability in a Windows Wi-Fi driver that affects all versions of Windows and Windows Server. Patches are available. There's not a lot of details from Microsoft about the attack, other than that attacker does need to have proximity to the target device. But once they have that, all that's required for the attack is to send, quote, a malicious networking packet to an adjacent system that is employing a Wi-Fi networking adapter, which could enable remote code execution, end quote.
Yes, obviously this is right up my alley, so I'm very interested in this. The fact that there is virtually no information on this from the vulnerability database, from Microsoft itself, other than patch. We'll put the link to the information that we do have, but this Microsoft link here, I'm going to pop it open and just kind of pull a couple things off to mention for you guys that are listening. So it shows the base score metrics: attack complexity of low, privilege required, none, user interaction required, none.
Mm.
So this is affecting all versions of Windows.
Yep.
If you're looking for it, it's going to be CVE number 2024-30078. So this year's CVE 30078. Let's keep an eye on this. This is a score of 8.8 out of 10. The one thing that I've seen from researchers, well, two pieces of data. One group at least has reverse engineered the patch that was released. So there is a patch for this. Definitely apply that Windows patch. I think it's the around June 11th, 15th, something like that.
Mhm.
They reverse engineered the patch. It has something to do with a VLAN tag in the packet coming into the network interface in the wireless NIC.
Mm.
Now, we don't usually tag VLANs over the air like that. You would tag it on the back end when it egresses onto the wired network, but over the air, we don't usually do that. So I'm kind of curious about a few different things here, the mechanism of that. And then also, it did state that you have to have, adjacency, so proximity to the target device, right? So that you can transmit to it, but also that you had to be on the same network, the same wireless SSID. So what that makes me wonder is then if the network has peer isolation enabled. So in the Wi-Fi world, an SSID, a wireless network, is a layer 2 broadcast domain, just like a hub, right?
Mhm.
But you can enable peer isolation, which basically says you're going to break up that layer 2 domain such that endpoints cannot communicate directly with each other.
Okay.
I'm curious if that prevents this attack, at least on that network. It's not a solution because obviously if you take that device and then you go to Starbucks or Hilton or Marriott.
Right, where they don't have that peer segmentation, implemented,
Yeah.
right. Uh-huh.
And a lot of, corporate networks don't have peer isolation enabled for a lot of different reasons. One of them being that a long time ago, in a land far, far away, when you used to purchase Wi-Fi products, the peer isolation was enabled by default. It was on.
Mhm.
And then all of the like MDNS, Bonjour protocols, all that stuff started happening. Apple leading the way with everything, talking to everything else directly. Windows does the same thing with different protocols, all of our screencasting, the list goes on. But all of these MDNS things require that peer communication in some way. And so the vendors started not shipping the product with that enabled.
Mhm. By default, yeah. Mhm.
Long story short, most networks don't have that enabled. And in fact, Drew, when we were at RSA and we were talking to the SOC team there that was monitoring the network, one of the things we asked was, do you have peer isolation on this guest public network? And their answer was no, because it was basically wild, wild west, do what you want to on it.
Yep.
So long story short, you definitely need to implement that patch. I would do that sooner rather than later. This is one Wi-Fi vulnerability on the heels of several other wireless, including Bluetooth vulnerabilities that have come out in the past, 12 months or so that are still being analyzed. As we find out more, I'll post some stuff on LinkedIn. We might discuss it here again next week if we get new information. Really curious. I have not yet seen a working proof of concept, although there are some people claiming to have one and selling it for like $5,000. I don't know if that's true or not.
A vulnerability like this, you could see it being valuable for someone looking to do targeted exploits, again, because you need that proximity and to be on the same wireless network as the target. This does seem like it's not sort of a mass attack. You're doing some target hunting.
I'll just throw this out there. One of the articles said, for those working from home or at the office, that this vulnerability is far less concerning. And I'm going to throw out there, I don't agree with that. If the attacker just has to be on the same network and there's a network that they can easily get onto.
Mhm.
And really that for an attacker that's motivated, that's gonna be anything that's not probably configured 802.1x network, because if it's like a WPA2 passphrase network,
Mhm.
it's very easy for them to capture what they need to and break that passphrase and get onto the network. That's trivial. That's no problem. So, especially in the home office, and I kind of feel like if you are targeting somebody at that level, if you find out where they live or you find out where they're working or you find out right where the business office is, that just makes it easier. I don't agree that if you're at a home office or in an office, you are not vulnerable. Just patch your stuff, people.
As always. All right, moving on. There's a recent Wall Street Journal article describing how generative AI tools are helping scammers to be more effective. So, warning signs that we typically rely on, like poor spelling or weird sentence structures that could tip you off, may be cleaned up by Gen AI tools. And there's other things that they can leverage, like voice cloning and so on.
Yeah, we had a thread. So in the Slack community that I mentioned on our channel there, Paul from Australia, we had a conversation around the use of AI for these purposes and by these scammers and what these tools were doing and being used for. And I had mentioned some apps and platforms like Fraud GPT and Worm GPT. And I don't remember which one does what at this point, but basically they're platforms and services for scammers and attackers and fraudsters to come on and get things that are already canned for them. So they have access to these different AI tools that can clean up language for them, but also pre-canned emails, pre-canned templates,
Mm,
landing pages for phishing campaigns,
wow.
things that already look like your bank or, whatever. And so that's definitely growing just this week. I've had to contact, and I posted this on LinkedIn, an organization I work with had fraudulent requests coming in from Phillips 66 and Maztec, where attackers or scammers had registered copycat domains that
Mm,
looked like the real domain.
mhm,
If you put it in the browser, it actually redirected directly to the real site very quickly. So you wouldn't necessarily notice unless you dug into copying and pasting into a who is. They scraped the full email signatures of the actual people who they are pretending to be.
mhm,
And in one case, went so far as to both of the emails were trying to establish a vendor relationship, right, with the company. And one coming from the pretext of a procurement office with a diversity program of which the company fits the profile for. And they even, copied a supplier enablement email on the introductory email. So it's skimming it. It looks very, very, very legit. And I actually had to do a double take and start, digging into this a little bit further.
yep.
The only triggering thing for me was why would the director of procurement at a company this size be emailing somebody directly? So, yeah, watch out. They're getting sneaky. They're using the AIs.
Yeah, it's kind of frustrating. And I'll also just to add on to the pile, I came across a recent article from a tech news site called Proof News. They surveyed 8 voice cloning tools. These are tools that use AI to essentially copy someone's voice based on a sample you provide. And they found that most of these sites, quote, make little or no effort to ensure that the voices being cloned belong to consenting adult humans. So obviously, if you are a politician or a voice actor or a public figure, you don't want your voice being misused like that. But also for regular citizens, non-consensual voice cloning could be a tool for scammers, for stalkers, for abusers. And it seems like these sites are not doing a great job on ensuring that folks have consent to actually get a copy of their voice made. So just something else to add to the issues we're dealing with.
Yeah, and actually, I was gonna try to pull this story up because now that you mentioned that, I saw something. It was a county in Maryland. I mean, it might have been Baltimore. The most recent criminal case involving artificial intelligence emerged last week from a Maryland high school where police say a principal was framed as racist by a fake recording of his voice.
Uh-huh.
It was a AI tool that had been used to create a deep fake, basically.
Yep.
It's a completely fake audio clip
Yep.
that hit just in the past couple weeks. And there have been some laws. I know I saw also another note, I think, coming through this week about Tennessee with an Elvis Act that's designed to protect artists and people that have intellectual property of that sort. But I mean, yeah, a principal at a school, that was an interesting story.
Those kids are clever.
They are clever.
And they got a whole suite of tools to play with.
They do.
Yeah. And again, we'll have links to all these stories in the show notes of the Company Podcast. We'll move on. More than 145,000 Asus routers are exposed to a vulnerability that, if exploited, could enable remote authentication bypass on the device. Asus has issued a notification recommending a firmware upgrade. This has a CVSS score of 9.8. We're sticking with the 9.8 this week, it sounds like.
Mhm. That is the sweet number. Yeah, this is concerning. Obviously, when we start talking about orders of magnitude of hundreds of thousands of devices and the type of devices that are typically found in small offices or home offices, not in an enterprise that's actively inventorying, updating,
Right.
monitoring, and managing these things, right?
Right.
145, 150,000 devices is a lot. And those are probably very onesie twosies from a deployment standpoint, this organization, this site, et cetera. There's many risks here. I think the two big things that are standing out to me are there's an entry point into that infrastructure, which is probably also not monitored internally. If they're not monitoring the ingress and egress points of it with a router, then they're probably not really monitoring much of anything else. So this is some opportunity, I think, to help, spread the good word and get out there and talk to your local chambers of commerce, your local small businesses, and, bring some awareness to this. But also, this is exactly how a lot of those anonymity networks and botnets start, right? So even if they're not coming into your environment, if they're taking over that many devices back to the days of, Mirai and the botnets, we have two layers here. The first swirl of those type of botnets were used just for kids playing basically, and taking down gamers and gaming sites. That escalated, into taking down some pretty notable internet sites, including Brian Krebs's website years ago.
Right.
But, more recently, we're dealing with nation states that are launching a lot of these attacks, and they are creating some adjacency to our critical infrastructure here in the US. And so that is really, to me, the most alarming piece of this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so even if you don't have one of these routers, you could still experience repercussions from these vulnerabilities.
Absolutely. The entire community could. So they do have a security advisor. If you just go to their website, we'll put the link in the show notes. Again, you guys listening and you gals listening, the people who are the target audience for this might not be listening, but please, go out and share this as much as you can in your networks.
You may see them at a summer barbecue or something. Just pop in the house and check to see if they have an Asus router and help them out. Moving on, Dutch officials have released a report warning that Fortinet VPNs may still be compromised by Chinese state actors from a vulnerability uncovered back in November of 2022. According to a story in Ars Technica, Fortinet fixed the vulnerability, but then waited more than 2 weeks to publicly disclose it back in 2022. In this month's report, released in June 2024, Dutch officials claim that more than 14,000 Fortinet devices were infected by Chinese malware, codenamed Coathanger, in late 2022 and early 2023, including Western governments and corporate targets. At present, says the report, quote, Dutch intelligence services therefore state that it is likely that the state actor still has access to the systems of a significant number of victims. Ars Technica published its article on June 11th, and as of this recording date, the article hasn't been updated to include any response from Fortinet about why it waited so long originally to disclose the original vulnerability, which also had a severity rating of 9.8.
Oh gosh, this one breaks my heart a little bit in a few different ways. So I know that Fortinet, they have such a reputation. Everybody thinks Fortinet is really just for small business, that they don't take, R&D seriously. I have a soft spot in my heart for Fortinet because the founders are engineers. The company is very R&D focused. They have literally walls, plural, of patents in their headquarters office. Corporate culture there is to value, innovation, research, security. They take it seriously. They roll their solutions up into kind of a single product management team. And so the fact that something like this has happened now, a vulnerability and a breach and somebody writing an OS specific piece of malware, which is what happened with Coathanger. They wrote malware specifically for this platform and delivered it. That can, could, and does and has happened to all of the vendors. That's
Sure.
not specific to Fortinet.
Yep.
What's disappointing to me, though, because I think the numbers are close to, they think 20,000 appliances now that have been compromised, was this lapse that they very quietly rolled out some patches with a severity of 9.8, right?
Yep.
Open the windows and scream down the streets and make sure everybody's protected, especially with the types of organizations that have these in place. Because despite what people might think, these are not just small businesses. Fortinet security products are in very large organizations
Yep.
and a lot of government agencies. They're not just small potatoes, Soho solutions. I'm a little disappointed. I'm interested to see how they respond to this. I'm also interested to see if the government is gonna intervene and, if there's gonna be some type of fine or penalty or an investigation. We've got all sorts of investigations happening with the different review boards now. So maybe there's an explanation, maybe there's a little bit more to this. I'm hoping there's another side to the story, but for the manufacturers, bad news doesn't age well. You know, it's gonna get out there anyway. Just go ahead and get in front of it and help people protect themselves instead of sitting on this type of information.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why it's embarrassing for a security company to have vulnerabilities and to disclose those vulnerabilities, but the embarrassment is compounded if you don't say anything and it gets exploited in a very significant way. That's even worse. It's worse for you, it's worse for your customers. So yeah, curious why they waited 2 weeks from, fixing the problem to telling people about it. And again, this was back in 2022/2023. I'm also sort of curious why the Dutch government is bringing it up now. That the report that I looked at did not have a lot of detail about active threats and ongoing exploits and stuff. So I'm curious about the Dutch government's motivation in trying to draw attention to this at the moment. I don't know if there's something else there. That part is curious to me. Regardless, if you've got a Fortinet VPN, you may be wanting to take an extra look just to be sure that that vulnerability is fixed, and also look for anomalies and stuff that may indicate compromise, because obviously these devices are being targeted. And I will say, as a category, things like VPNs, remote access tools, and so on are prime targets, and so need your extra attention. And that kind of leads into our next story here.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like Denmark's very active in the cybersecurity space at the moment.
The Netherlands?
I'm guessing that somebody got some splaining to do. And probably they have systems that have been impacted by this. And, Europe is getting very serious about holding vendors' feet to the fire and
Mhm.
setting these expectations. I think even when the US, when we do a kind of a crappy job of that, I think Europe is stepping up, and Australia and New Zealand as well. And they're saying, you have to do better. Here's what we expect.
For sure. All right, just a couple more stories before we wrap. As of our recording on June 27th, there's chatter emerging about the potential compromise of TeamViewer, which makes remote access software for device support and management. And just to be clear, TeamViewer is saying everything's fine. I'll read part of an official statement that they posted on June 26th. They do say they detected an irregularity in their internal IT environment, but they've investigated and implemented remediation measures. TeamViewer also says, quote, "There is no evidence to suggest that the product environment or customer data is affected. Investigations are ongoing, and our primary focus remains to ensure the integrity of our systems," end quote. JJ, you are seeing some chatter coming up in the back channels.
Yeah. Well, some back, some forward, some front and center. So another thing I think coming out of, like, the Dutch Digital Trust Center, there was a community there. I don't wanna draw parallels to things like InfraGard here, but there's InfoSec people that they have got of these information sharing communities and platforms. So there's a research group, a threat intel group that's involved in some of this, and one of the health ISACs, here's a different statement. So this is all happening today, like, in the past 2 hours or less.
Yeah, as of our recording time on the 27th. Yeah.
So, on June 27th, Health ISAC received information from a trusted intelligence partner that APT29 is actively exploiting TeamViewer. So, Health ISAC recommends reviewing logs for any unusual remote desktop traffic. Threat actors have been observed leveraging remote access tools. TeamViewer has been observed being exploited by threat actors associated with APT29, blah, blah, blah. So, I'm not completely convinced. And frankly, I don't know that any company of any meaningful size can hear something day 0, which would have been yesterday, the 26th, and within 24 hours be able to say, "No, we're definitely sure nothing has happened." It just takes time.
Yep.
So either they knew before and they've already done enough of an investigation, or this is still very fresh and there might be more to come.
Yeah, so just a heads up, and we'll follow up on this. And again, to just make it clear, these are only allegations, and TeamViewer's official position is that there's no problems. So we'll follow up on this as we get more details.
I saw, like, the first chatter of this on Twitter, which then was a cross post of a screenshot coming out of Mastodon, which was then another screenshot of something coming off of, like, pick a platform, people. I don't care what Twitter, Blue Sky, Mastodon, whatever you wanna do, LinkedIn. I can't keep up with you all across 12 different platforms. Let's just pick one. Can we all just agree on one, and we'll watch that one?
Sorry, JJ. I think you're going to need no single pane of glass for you here.
Dang it.
The Cloud Security Alliance has produced a paper called Zero Trust Guidance for Critical Infrastructure. JJ, you're actually an author on the paper, and it is now open for peer review, and you're here to request folks to come and take a look.
Yes. Completely self-serving item here. Now, this is volunteer, and Cloud Security Alliance is a not-for-profit. So if you go over to cloudsecurityalliance.org, we will put the link in the show notes, but there's the zero trust guidance for critical infrastructure. Specifically, this is for operational technology and ICS environments. So industrial controls,
Mhm.
it's taking the 5-step approach of zero trust and putting that in the language and the framework appropriate for OT and ICS environments, which is a little bit different than enterprise IT. This is one of those cases, it's open for peer review until July 11th, 2024. The more eyes that are on this and the more, input and feedback we get, I think the better that this document is gonna be. I am one of the lead authors on it. There are several other contributing authors. We're trying to get everybody's, name updated in there appropriately.
Mhm.
But feedback and reviews, if you work in that space, we wanna make sure it's technically accurate. We wanna make sure that it has the right information and that it's written in a consumable way.
And then the point is to help folks, consider and apply zero trust principles to these OT and IC environments.
Exactly, and, kind of the target audience here we envision is it is written with language that's appropriate for any standard, technical professional,
Mhm.
but with the OT in mind. So what that means is that we are expecting, network security engineers, architects, security architects that are attached possibly or analysts to a CISO's office. So what we're seeing is OT has a big spotlight on it. It's targeted. And for the most part, organizations, the OT security is being rolled up underneath the same team that handles enterprise IT security.
Mhm.
But those environments and those requirements are very different, and the knowledge is very different. And so, what we're trying to do is two things: educate the enterprise IT folks on what it means to secure OT in the context of zero trust, but also to leverage the frameworks, the standards that we already have in OT and ICS. So, for example, this document talks about when and where and how to apply, the zone and conduit model, how to use their Purdue reference architecture as a kind of a collaborative tool, not necessarily as an actual reference architecture, but a way to have a conversation between OT and IT, how to use and apply, 62443 for risk assessments and architectures. And so we're trying to not reinvent the wheel, but go, okay, here's what we call these things in the OT space. Here's what you need to know that's different.
Mhm.
So we're, very interested in feedback on that in the next coming weeks.
All right. Yeah, we'll have that link in the show notes. And again, it's open for peer review through July 11th, 2024. All right, we'll wrap up on JJ some things you learned recently as you've been out and about in the world.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, I was at the Techno Security Conference and I was speaking on Wi-Fi security and meeting some folks down there. And one of the most interesting sessions I attended, there were several great ones, by the way, but one of the most interesting ones was about end-to-end encryption apps and some research around that. And so the Techno Security Conference, the longer name, it's like the Techno and Digital Forensics Security Conference. And so there's a lot of it's kind of where law enforcement from all over the world comes to learn about, forensics and everything else, but they also have a heavy cybersecurity presence and topics as well. And so this was a session about end-to-end encryption apps, but it was really focused on Telegram, which I've heard of, but I've never used, I've never really dug into it. And it was really eye-opening to me. So, I mentioned earlier some of the tools on the AI side that scammers are using, like Fraud GPT,
Mhm.
Worm GPT. Well, Telegram is not just a messaging app. Basically, the entirety of the dark web has been recreated within Telegram because of its anonymity and because they have their own digital currency and everything is obscured because it is end-to-end encryption. And so this session by Stephen Arnold kind of walked through, how Telegram works behind the scenes and some of the information I frankly have no clue how he was able to acquire the information. It wasn't recorded. I think he's going to have a paper or a book about it soon. So we'll definitely circle back with you guys on that and share that. And then also just I think recently, Telegram announced that they're running very lean with something like just 30 engineers.
Wow.
And I think they thought that was going to be impressive, but the rest of the world is kind of going, well, whoa. Because when you look at the magnitude of this, it's not just a messaging app, right? Like I don't even know how many users they have, but it's an alarming number.
Mhm. Yeah, and end-to-end encryption is one of those things that you absolutely have to get right. And it's very difficult in a mobile environment with lots of users, lots of moving parts.
It is.
Yeah. Wow. Sounds cool to your funders, but not to everybody else.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, I want to hear about Africa.
Right. Sure. If you're not interested in my vacation, this is the time to sign off. And thank you for listening. But We're diverging here. Yes, so I was away in late May and early June to London and Nairobi, Kenya. I was there because my wife, who is a psychology professor, had a psychology conference in Nairobi, and I was like, I'll go with you. That's the reason we were there. Her conference was exciting. I've been to Africa, but I'd never been to Nairobi. It's an amazing city. It's a very modern city. Everybody there was great. The telecom infrastructure is really good. We used Uber there all the time to get around. The mobile infrastructure is great. They've also got something called M-Pesa, which is essentially, a digital mobile payments platform. We didn't use it because we didn't need it, but that's how a lot of folks pay for everything there. So it's impressive, how advanced, frankly, it is in this part of Africa, the infrastructure. And we also did some fun stuff. We took a half-day safari at Nairobi National Park, which is an animal preserve just outside the city. Drove around in a van with a driver and saw lions and giraffes and rhinos and elephants. We went to an elephant sanctuary, went to a giraffe sanctuary. It was a fantastic trip. The people in Kenya and Nairobi were fantastic, great hosts. So highly recommended if you have a chance to go, do go.
I can't wait to see the photos.
I have to get them onto Slack.
Do you have like a photo stream happening on Twitter or anywhere we can look?
I honestly didn't take a lot of photos because I'm not that person, but I'll dig through my phone and see what I have.
True. Africa. Giraffes?
I do have some giraffe and lion photos. I'll put those up.
Okay. I'm looking at a map while you're talking and I see Nairobi and I'm just acclimating myself to where this is in the world exactly. And I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but there's a Chulu Hills just south of that that I keep glancing at and it looks like Cthulhu Hills. That's just making me giggle. So
I did not encounter any maddening presences from beyond our sphere of reality. So just to reassure you of that.
Oh, all right, guys and gals. Well, thanks, Drew. And I'm going to be asking you more and more questions about this trip because I'm really interested in that part of the world and all of the animals and the nature that's there. But for everybody else, we'll spare you those details right now. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week and come find us on Slack.
Thanks for listening.